Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tales from the Code, a very, very special panel for Virtual HorrorCon 2022. Thank you for joining us for the last day today. We're about halfway through, but there's still a lot of fun stuff to come. APs till about midnight, panels till about midnight. It's going to be a wild ride for sure. And before I get into the meat of what Tales from the Code is going to be about, let me go ahead and introduce my panelists. It's a very small panel today, but that's because I think, it's a lot about discussion. So go ahead, panelists, introduce yourself, please.
Hello, my name is Rue. I use he or they pronouns, and you can find me on Twitter as @IlanaKnight13. Everywhere else it's just Ilana Knight. I'm a tabletop game developer, designer, sensitivity consultant, and actual play performer.
Awesome. I'm Ian E. Muller. I have been on way too much stuff because I am the founder of Gehenna Gaming, the original creator of Virtual HorrorCon, and Nick's boss. So I'm kidding. We don't jive with that here. And I use he they pronouns, and that's all I'm really going to jump into about myself right now.
And that just leaves me. I'm the host for today. I'm the panelist. I'm Nick Francia. You can find me at Nobleman Nick. I use he, they pronouns, and I'm production and marketing manager at Gehenna Gaming. Other than that, I'm a tabletop streamer. I am also a TTRPG designer. My only published work currently, because there's a lot of stuff in there, is the Forgotten Skins, a supplement for Monster Hearts 2nd Edition. So if you've ever played any of those skins, shout out to y'all.
Oh yeah, I guess I do. I'm a TTRPG writer and
editor. Yeah, you have. You were on a few stuff.
Yeah.
And Rue, something that's interesting to learn about you that it never got brought up in both the panels, but I think you deserve a shout out, is that you were actually featured on NBC for raising $400,000 in transgendered rights, which is awesome. So I just want to give a round of applause for that.
Thank you. And I was excited to be the project manager on that. I can't claim all the credit for the people who donated their games to the bundle, obviously. So
nice.
So today we're talking about our title of our panel is Tales from the Code. And kind of just to decipher what that means is we're going to be talking about horror games today, specifically horror video games, and the lessons about storytelling, pacing, and content in general that we can learn from video games. Because I really think that horror video games can really teach us a thing or two about horror, more so than like your normal movie or TV shows, because unlike movies or TV shows, you actually share the idea of having a player, and that player being the one to kind of guide the choices or guide the pace of how it is. So my first question that I would love to get both your opinions on is, what do you think is the goal of a good horror game?
You want me to jump in?
It's a loaded question. Yeah.
I think that I think, at least for me, what I'm looking for in a game is a game that makes me anything that makes me rethink my own perspective on the world, or anything that makes me question status quos and status norms. Even if it's in a what if situation, I think that the games that make you question your own what reality is, or make you question your place in it, have a much stronger visceral reaction to them, an emotional reaction.
I think kind of playing off of that, I like horror games that when I'm not playing them, I'm still thinking about elements of them. And I think that comes a lot with not only having immersive world building and things like that, but also what Ian was saying, games that make you think about things, and when there are aspects of a game that are clearly exaggerated or fantastical, but you can still see in everyday life, and then you stop and think oh, if this was pushed just a little bit further, we would be in the universe of that game.
Yeah.
I think it harkens back kind of to what we were saying on previous panels, where a lot of horror is about themes and tones and moods. And that's kind of what you both have. I'm kind of cooking it up to, is that they have the horror games that to you that are both impactful are ones that have themes that kind of linger on with you as it goes ahead. And I think that's, I think that's awesome.
there's a game that I haven't finished it yet. But I'm a little obsessed with that. Not a lot of people. It's an indie horror video game called Among the Sleep.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you play as a infant slash toddler. And it's entirely about like how that kid sees the world around them while they're just trying to find their mom because there was a storm and they were scared. And the world warps around you and becomes more fantastical and more terrifying. And that game captures a lot of what I look for in horror games. And you're helpless, but you're not helpless at the same time. Like, you're very good at hiding. You're very good at moving away from things quickly because you go unnoticed. So it's one of those like good crossovers of a survival horror game that is scary, but does it in a way that is accessible to a lot of people and very much shows you how different perspectives can make things scary when they're perfectly normal things to other people.
The lesson I kind of think we get here is like that horror from the uncanny. I mean, it's something that because we even have fantasy from the uncanny. I mean, like Alice in Wonderland is like their traditional kind of sense, the unhorror version of that, where honestly you probably could look at Alice in Wonderland as a horror
American
story
McGee's
itself.
Alice is pretty much a horror game.
Yeah.
And something that I think is kind of like very interesting when you mentioned Among the Sleep is like taking that template as playing as a child and what they see and identify. That could be remixed in so many ways and make kind of an original identity in its own, because like the idea of like a kid seeing something and making these like horrific kind of like levels and designs after it is something that's even used in like The Binding of Isaac, and those are two very different games.
Oh yeah.
And I think like oh sorry
no what were you saying?
I think a lot of like what horror plays on in terms of like making things scary is the unknown, and that's why like playing as a child who doesn't know a lot of things, like from the perspective of a child or someone dropped in an entirely new situation, so much is unknown, and that really adds to like the atmosphere as well, which is really cool.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a great segue into the next question. So something I've noticed about horror games is that they either kind of fall into one or two characters. Either they're designed to make you afraid or they're designed to make you panic. In translating that to TTRPGs or just your own kind of sense playing those games, what is the more effective one?
I'm more fond personally of that like deeper lingering fear. And also especially in tabletop games, because in tabletop games you don't have, or at least it's more difficult to have the touchstones needed to make like a jump scare and make yourself panic in the way that a game or a movie could, because you can't like turn off all the lights in your house and cause a screaming sound to happen while you're playing. But you can like build that sense of dread and like the impending sense of something a lot easier in those more fear-based games than panic ones. And like then you can layer on the atmosphere, and some scenes can take away from it and some scenes can add to it, and it becomes a lot more fluid, as opposed to like a panic-based game like either builds to one scary incident or has a bunch throughout that just kind of like get your heart racing and then it stops again, which can feel a little bit more jagged, I think, in a tabletop sense.
I liken it almost to like, because if we're specifically looking at video games, you have so many different moods within a game, because like Doom is technically a horror game. Nothing about that game is scary to me, but your adrenaline is going the entire time, especially if you're playing on nightmare mode. And that's what I think of when you say panic, like the games that are pushing for an adrenaline response versus a game like Silent Hill or Alan Wake or Alan Wake is one of my favorite games.
Silent Hill is one of mine.
The Silent Hill's up there too. Games that are more investigative, and there are jump scares, and there are things that cause an adrenaline response, but they're fewer and farther between, with a dull, lingering sense of tension and terror throughout the entire game, and I think those are much more effective.
Mm-hmm. Kind of like the difference between, say, something like Silent Hill versus, which is, like you said, both of you are very much atmospheric and something that's multi-layered that'll stick with you, versus, say, something like Dead Space, which, I think Dead Space is an excellent horror game.
Yeah.
But I would definitely think that stands on more panic than
fear.
I'd
agree. I think a good example would be like, I played these at the same time, so they always stick with me as a good comparison. Outlast and Doki Doki Literature Club.
Yeah.
They're both horror games. Spoilers for Doki Doki Literature Club if you haven't played it. That, like, Outlast frustrated me because you're in a situation where it's almost Resident Evil if they just put a gun in your hand.
Gun in your hand, yeah.
But you don't have one. Versus a game that something is just wrong and it takes you playing through the game to figure out what it is. And that was much more unnerving to me.
A similar issue I had, like as someone who loves a lot of the Silent Hill games, for their atmosphere and that fear building, is that Shattered Memories didn't have that for me because it was also that panic-induced based where you were always supposed to be running. It also doesn't help to play it on the Wii because the controls are very bad. But it didn't have the Silent Hill feel for me because there was none of that investigative stuff, none of that like exploration and being like stopped. It was all running and hiding from things that jumped out at you, and that like didn't have the same Silent Hill feel to me.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And that makes a lot of sense too, because I remember playing Shattered Memories on my PSP. So something trying to scare me from my hand.
A 5-inch screen.
Yeah, I mean,
I have a really hard time playing horror mobile games for that reason. I'm like, okay, phone go away. Look, the problem's gone.
But something that I actually thought was very interesting to play devil's advocate to Shattered Memories is I really like the psychological horror twist they put on it.
Oh yeah.
What about like concepts like that where a video game tries like programmed to like read you? Because obviously, like, maybe not obviously, but sometimes GMs will try to read their players and kind of cook up and customize what will be the most effective. How do you feel about video games doing that?
The most effective use of that I have ever experienced was Metal Gear Solid.
With Psycho Mantis?
Psycho Mantis literally reads your memory card and talks about the other games you've played.
Inscription does something kind of similar. It reads your Steam library.
Yeah. That level of it, like fourth wall breaking, is phenomenal to me because the first time that you play through Metal Gear Solid, it's really I think it's the first game that ever did anything like that. I could be wrong. I didn't play a lot of video games back then, so it's very unnerving. You're like, why are you talking to me about Castlevania Symphony of the Night, buddy? Yes, I realize I've played 400 hours into that game. What are you doing to me? But I think, and I haven't played. I did play Inscription, but I haven't played a lot of games that have really captured that since. And I think that level of it is very interesting. I think there's a lot. I don't know if they've implemented any of this technology yet, but I know there was a lot of discussion about games using webcams or VR stuff to eye tracking and emotion tracking and things like that. I would be interested to see how that gets implemented in a video game sense, in a non-creepy stealing your identity sort of way, but I've used to work in the biometric space and it's terrifying. But I don't know where the technology is for that yet, and I don't know how successful it would be.
Yeah, I think it would be fascinating if they could, like, using like webcams or whatever, like notice which things get your like pupillary response and bring those into the game more often. Like if you are visibly scared by heights, like putting your character on heights and like having essentially like a malleable level design within the game itself would be fascinating.
Stanley Parable, but the entire point of the first half of the game is just reading your responses to different situations, and then it creates procedurally creates an actual game after that. That would be really interesting.
Yeah.
It's kind of going in, because I didn't even think about the somatic components between video games and the player, and that's And that's really interesting. So I'm going to delve off on a little bit of on a side that I wasn't even ready to go to, because we were talking about Until Dawn before this call started. I mean, and one of the most interesting things that Until Dawn did was the whole idea of like keep your controller still.
Yeah.
And like when you were really into the game, your hands would start to shake and you could see the sensor bouncing in and out. So
the new game has a similar mechanic. Sorry, someone in the chat was talking about heart rate monitors, and I think it'd be fascinating to have your controller do that. But the Quarry has a similar mechanic. It's the no breathing mechanic, where you have to like hold a certain button down and hold your controller entirely straight, because I guess they realized that folks were putting their controllers down to like not have the hand shaking.
Oh,
so now you have to hold a button and hold the controller straight, and like really focus on keeping it like that.
What is that? I'm trying to think. There's two games that pop into mind. I lost one of them because we started talking about Until Dawn.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
That was all me.
The other one is, I haven't actually finished this game yet for a variety of reasons, but Perception, which is a game where you play as a blind person. And the entire game is done with echolocation. You tapping your cane, and waves come out, and they kind of show you where all the objects are around you, and then it goes dark again. And then it reaches a point where, like, things can track you by the noise you're making, but you can't see if you're not making noise. Which I think is a really interesting mechanic. I'm trying to remember what the other one was. If I think of it, I'll bring it back up.
There's a game, it's not necessarily a horror game, but I think this would also be a very interesting, just like,
I remembered.
It's called The Unfinished Swan. And the idea is that you are an artist. And so the levels start out as basically completely white. And your only thing that you have is an ink blot, is like cans of paint that you can throw. Sorry, I was trying to mix up my letters. And as you start tossing the paint, you're starting to reveal the level. Like you could walk straight across and you might not hit anything, but as you start throwing paint, you can see, okay, there's stairs here. I can go up these stairs, or here's a door that I can go through.
That sounds interesting. The game that you made me think of, Nick, with the segue into the question with like Until Dawn, was Heavy Rain. And if you haven't played Heavy Rain, spoilers, there's a scene where you have to make the character cut his finger off, and the controller starts shaking. They max out the vibration in the controller for the PS3, and like you have to like force the joysticks into specific positions while the controller is vibrating out of your hand, and it's really well done.
And kind of going in through like somatic components, and so we kind of talked about like the controls to make something horror and the just overall this kind of philosophy. But now I want to talk about something that I think is essential. We're talking about like level designs and just setting, because that's how horror games can kind of live or die. And then translating that into TTRPG, describing the environment that you're in can also be more horrifying than any stat block monster they can find. So what are some examples that you can think of, or what makes a good level design in horror video games?
As a lifelong Silent Hill stan, I'm gonna one of my favorite things about Silent Hill is the fog, which was originally because they didn't have the time and money to like fully render out Silent Hill, and so they just kind of put fog places and put broken roads places where they couldn't build anything out from there, but like found a way to implement it into the setting where you always felt like there was more to this place that you just couldn't see. And I love like in horror, like only being able to see part of something or only being aware of like the surface level of what's happening, while a bunch of other things happen behind closed doors, behind fog, behind mirrors, and like that sort of dissonance between like character knowledge in the space versus like personal knowledge. Like if you the player know that you're playing a horror game, but the character you're playing can't tell because of all these things that are in their way, and sort of like how that adds to the space. So like I'm a big fan of redacting information from environments until you like uncover it later.
And that's a good way of just turning what is in it like inherently a weakness of the engine into its own positive. Ian, it looked like you're about to say something.
No, just in general, answering the question. That is one of my favorites. Something I don't like, and it's so common in games that it's kind of like it's the point of the game, but so it's dumb to not like it. But just the concept, and it's a Resident Evil thing, really. Like it's the point of Resident Evil at the end of the day, which is find the item to unlock the door to move to the next section, where you have to find the item that unlocks the door to move to the next section, and then find the item to and I love the Resident Evil series for the storytelling, but like that general game mechanic gets very frustrating for me, whereas how Silent Hill does it, I love. The thing that I enjoy a lot, and this comes back to kind of the first question, I like things that make you question reality, and I like, especially in video games, subverting expectations, where either you enter an area you've been before but they've changed it, or labyrinths. Being in an area where it's almost impossible to tell where you're going or if you've been in an area before because it all looks the same, it's a maze, that sort of thing. Like forcing you through that is more engaging with me than nope, just find the key that unlocks the door and then find the key that unlocks the next door, sort of thing. I'd rather get lost in the same like building for 5 hours because every room looks the same.
Yeah, I'm perpetually sad about PT being all that came from that. Because PT did what you're talking about, like I feel immensely well, in that you never were anywhere except those 3 rooms. But those 3 rooms changed every time you went through them, and there were new things to find or things missing. And just like the growing sense of like being watched and followed in that really small space.
So there's 2 examples I can think of immediately, especially when you mentioned PT, is that in Resident Evil 8, they pretty much ripped a part of PT for that game. And it works exceptionally well. So much so that it is the standout part of that game, like hands down. And then another one I can think of is going back to Dead Space, because I really that's a game I did not expect to really enjoy, and I just immensely do. Is that safe rooms are always considered safe in that game until the very end. I think it's the second to last safe room you go to upgrade your weapon, and boom, you're immediately attacked. I think they do that in Last of Us Part 2, and it immediately just signs, okay, all bets are off, and you're not expecting it, and it just, you're always caught off guard.
God, all I know are Silent Hill games, which is not true, but you mentioned that, and Silent Hill 4, which is not the strongest game in the series
I like
by
the
any
though.
means. I like it, but
it had the best marketing though.
Yeah.
I remember getting PC Gamer and seeing an ad for it, and it was like spread across 3 different pages in PC Gamer, and it was like, home is where the heart is, and the liver, and the kidneys, and a little bit of spleen in the hallway, and I was just like, amazing, very well done for a horror game. Sorry,
but
continue.
oh yeah, no, you're good. The like healing mechanic in that game is going back to your apartment until you get to the second half of the game where your apartment's haunted and doesn't heal you anymore, and it actively hurts you to be there. So going back for inventory, which used to be like a good thing, becomes a bad thing in the second half of the game. And then you have nowhere that's safe. And that's the like same kind of thing as the Dead Space thing, where you're like, now I don't know where I can be.
And kind of to add on to a point that you said, I think it's okay to look at like a game series such as Silent Hill and be like, because it's such a masterclass in horror, like there's a reason why everyone always brings it up. And the fact that we can tie all the good stuff to Silent Hill, I think it's just a inherent just quality of how good that series is, even the ones that we might consider lackluster. Because I really enjoy Silent Hill Downpour. A lot of people don't, but I think that game has a lot of fun design choices, especially. Yeah, it kind of has a repetitive gameplay loop where it's like you explore an area, when you get to the end of the area, eventually it turns into the underworld, and the underworld is usually a big chase scene. But you still have that exploration, and that's what I really enjoy about it. So kind of going in. So some of the biggest things we can, and Silent Hill is actually one of these games that does not usually do this. Weapons and like inventory and horror. So there's even in TTRPGs, there seems to be two types of design philosophies when you go into horror. Either you're trying to emulate something like Call of Cthulhu, Dread, even 10 Candles, where you really don't have a weapon necessarily to deal with the horrors. It's just the core gameplay loop of just like, this is the bad things, avoid the bad things. Or say something like Alien RPG, or even some other parts of Call of Cthulhu, like the more pulpy stuff where you have weapons, you can fight back. What do you feel in terms of giving a player a weapon in a horror game?
I think there's some games that benefit from it. There's a franchise called Fear, which is FEAR. It's an acronym that is very much a shoot 'em, like first person shooter. You're a military unit, blah blah blah. The game is actually terrifying. They do a really good job still capturing horror within it. There's another games line that is very triggering for some people, so I don't want to like look it up before you Spec Ops: The Line.
Yes.
The entire game is a mental maze. It's ridiculous. It's really well written, but it is a wartime first-person shooter first and foremost mechanically, and I think that they work really well because they're written to subvert your expectation of what a shooter is, versus games like Outlast or some of the other ones.
Like Silent Hill does it. I mean, like, you have a weapon in Silent Hill, but it's not very effective.
You have a weapon, but super limited ammunition. Alan Wake is an interesting one, which I do want to touch on too, but I don't want to dominate the question. But I think that like how it's used is very important. I think it's fine to give you a weapon in a game, but like either subvert your expectation on how effective it is, or resource management and limiting your ability to actually use that weapon.
What about you, Ru?
Yeah, I'm of much the same opinion of like, if you're going to have a weapon in a horror game, it shouldn't like break the mold of the fact that it's horror. Like your gun or knife or whatever shouldn't be able to like cut through the fabric of what makes this universe scary. And so like some games that are like a little like some of the Resident Evil games get into this, where because you're killing so many zombies all the time, it doesn't feel like a horror game anymore. It feels like a Left 4 Dead sort of
Especially
thing.
The later ones.
Yeah. And so it's less of a horror game and more of a shooter, but you're playing Call of Duty Nazi zombies in an Umbrella facility.
You want to know what game I have logged the absolute most hours in? It is Call of Duty Nazi Zombies. I used to play that for hours every day. Anyway.
And so like at that point, it stops feeling like a horror game and becomes something else. Whereas like in the earlier games or in games like Silent Hill, where like you have a gun, but like if you're shooting at the like manifestation of your fear, it's not necessarily going to work. Or like The Evil Within, which I really like.
I love that series.
It's one of my favorites. And like everything is in your mind in The Evil Within. So like the weapons that you make work because you as your player character as a cop expect them to work. But then when you're up against like the entity that controls this space, things don't work because that entity doesn't want them to. And so taking that away from someone who as a cop is so used to gun fix problem, taking that away from you is like really fascinating. So I like when weapons are used in a way that like still lets them exist in their little horror zone.
So what I mentioned about Alan Wake that I want to touch on is I think Alan Wake has a very unique take on how weapons work, because your gun isn't really the weapon, the flashlight is. In the sense that you can shoot them a lot and they'll like the shadow creatures will go down, but you have to use the flashlight to actually do damage to them, to actually take them out. And as you progress through the game, you're literally trying to find weapons that create light, not really do damage. And I think that's a really cool subversion of how to use a weapon in a game and how to give players something constructive to work towards versus take gun, shoot, zombie, zombie dead, you win.
And something that's interesting is like sometimes like kind of what you were saying about the evil within, and that's something I'm definitely going to touch on at the end. We'll talk about going back to Dead Space again. Something I really love about the weapon design in that game. Hey, it's Silent Hill, Resident Evil, Dead Space. It's okay. We can keep circling between the three
pillars of horror video
gaming. Horrors. But I really love how, in order to further the story and the set piece that's in that world and that setting, all the weapons aren't necessarily weapons, like maybe one or two tools. Of them. Yeah, they're mining tools or engineering tools. And I think that is so great that your first like quote unquote gun that you have is a plasma cutter used to like cut pipes and metal.
I use that a lot in TTRPG, actually. Taking, especially in a horror game, taking weapons away from players makes them get very inventive. If you kind of make it clear, like, a weapon would help you right now. They're like, well, we have this, like, plasma torch in the medical lab. That's kind of a flamethrower. And I'm like, that is absolutely a flamethrower. Go for it. Oh, hey, look, it was very effective. So it's a good way to do things when your players... when it becomes obvious that a weapon would be the best way out of a situation, taking them away from them, but giving them creative ways to make their own is a really fun way to roleplay.
When, like, I've played a couple of games of The Corporation, the, like, megacorp capitalist horror game, that are kind of similar to Dead Space in that they involve mining and things like that. And similarly, I've always found that, like, when my players are left in a space where they don't necessarily have guns, they will pick up the like plasma pickaxe and whatever else might be in your like interstellar mining operation and make use of that. And I find that it adds a lot more to gameplay than like there being a box on a shelf that secretly has a handgun in it.
It's not a horror game, but there's another game that does that. Red something.
Oh, Guerrilla Red Faction.
Yes.
Is it? Yeah.
Yeah, like it's a mining colony. All of your weapons are mining equipment that are just being repurposed, and it's very much done in the like guerrilla uprising. Like the people are modifying these things to be effective weapons. It's a well done game.
Or even like Fatal Frame, where like your weapon is a camera. Like how awesome is that? So kind of moving on, and what would a horror like video game, especially horror video games, are often defined by their big bads or antagonists. Like when you think of Resident Evil, there's a good chance you think of Chris Redfield, but you think of Wesker. When you think of Silent Hill, do you think of James Sunderland or do you think of Pyramid Head first?
Yeah.
And I think 9 times out of 10 you would think of Pyramid Head.
Yeah, I mean, when you think of Resident Evil 8, what's the first character you think of?
The big, tall vampire lady.
Tall vampire lady. Or Heisenberg, but Mother Miranda. But it's very much not Ethan.
No. And I think a lot of that has to do with, like, so many horror games are first or behind the head, back of third person as well. So your protagonist is kind of faceless. For most of a horror game, and so you're not really thinking about who you're playing. What's more important is like the world and how it's affecting you.
You made me think about all the jokes we were making when they said we're announcing third person mode for Resident Evil 8, and I was like, oh god, Ethan's not a faceless horror anymore.
So kind of elaborating on the antagonist question, so something that we might be able to take like the idea from horror video games and for your table. What makes such a memorable horror antagonist? Like what makes Nemesis, or say something that's not Resident Evil or the Dead Space, what makes the necromorphs? Like why do those things just sit buried in our head?
For me, it's making antagonists relatable. Showing a human side or showing something that could be human, making them it's one part giving the players a way to relate to them, and another part uncanny valleying them. The xenomorphs in Alien are very similar to animals, panthers, insects. Like they take on, they're very relatable in a sense of, I understand what this is, but I don't understand what this is. I think that for me has always made something scarier and more memorable.
I'm a big fan of having them be very like omnipresent, but not always physically there.
Mm-hmm.
Like in The Evil Within, like Ruvik and I forget the name of the dude in the second game, Stefano, maybe?
Stefano, yep. It takes the picture.
Yeah.
Well,
cool. The picture. Well, although he's not the
yeah, it's the priest, but the
It's
same
the priest,
thing,
yeah.
yeah.
But like even though Ruvik himself is not like always in combat with you and always in conflict with you, there is like lingering like memos and like notes of like his presence that you can always feel. And I feel like that's true also of like Pyramid Head walking down the street and scraping his sword against the floor. Like you're always aware that at any moment the antagonist could come and confront you, and especially in earlier like levels of horror games when you're not prepared, you don't have anything to deal with them with, there is always the fear that they could come out and gank you at any moment, and because they're not, you know that in a sense they're kind of just playing with you and seeing how much you can do.
My brain went to Mr. X and
Yeah!
the AI glitch where if you go through the door at the right time, he just turns around, starts walking away, and then you can just like push the door open and he spins back around, and it's just like He's like, where are you? Sorry. But
no, you're fun.
And I like Outlast does that really well with the hiding mechanics, especially for it, they subvert expectations a lot, where it works for a huge chunk of the game and then it doesn't work for one specific part, and you can panic restart that scene if you don't realize that it's actually, that's how the game progresses. You're supposed to get caught by that at that specific point. Much like, going back to the house hurts you all of a sudden instead of is fine. One thing that I think is interesting, the Castlevania series is not a traditional horror game in the sense of it's not particularly scary, but it is a gothic horror game. It captures a lot of the essence of that. The reason that those games are so memorable is because of, in a different sense, it's the art and it's the physical character design becomes much more important in those. Games like Dead by Daylight also capture that. Some people have favorite hunt killers in Dead by Daylight simply because of how they look.
Yeah, and like all of your like survivors are just kind of like normal human people walking around, compared to like very like lovingly designed monsters. And like I think I love horror games because like the people who work on horror games to design monsters love designing monsters, and you can see in every aspect they have poured like their love for monsters into the game.
Yeah.
And you can like see that their character models took a lot, and Ethan doesn't have a face.
So we are coming up to the end here, about the last 10 minutes left. I want to leave the last 5 minutes for questions if possible. So I'm going to kind of get into the more fun, high concept design philosophy. What is your favorite set piece in a horror game? Set piece, sequence, anything.
In The Evil Within, in the second game, Stefano's like lair, where every single thing is an art piece, and you have to like move the art pieces and take pictures of them to like navigate the space. But at the same time, doing that like alerts the camera monster,
the camera obscura,
to your existence. And I just love that like everything in that is related to each other, and like everything's watching you, and I just love the atmosphere of that space.
What about you, Ian?
This is a little bit of a cop out. all of Rapture in BioShock.
Ooh, valid.
The world design in BioShock is one of the best experiences I've ever had, just looking around a map.
Because you're just kind of looking at someone's failed experiment almost.
Yeah. Or successful experiment, depending on which person you trust.
And while we're answering these last couple of questions, chat, go ahead and queue up your questions so we can kind of go through them and get it. And
we have a good one in there that I don't know if either of you have played the game, but I have a lot, so I can answer it.
Yeah, I'd not heard of that game. So
it's an old Call of Cthulhu. Dark Corners of the Earth is an old Call of Cthulhu. I think it's the first licensed Call of Cthulhu video game, actually. I've played a lot of it.
So I will say my favorite set piece from a horror game, I'm also going to say not the Evil Within 2, even though I love that game. It's one of my favorite horror games. The Evil Within 1, the fight with, I believe her name is Maria. The
sister?
Yeah.
Laura.
Yeah, Laura, there you go. Where you fight her in the furnace.
Yeah.
That showdown is because you get the way that fight leads in is that you think you're running away from her, and then you get to a point and it's like, no, you're in one big loop. So you're trying to figure out this puzzle and what it takes to take her down, while also basically running away from her. And I think it's just a claustrophobic nightmare of a mess. The monsters is so well designed and it's truly horrifying.
If I want to narrow it down to a specific part of a game, it's the second cabin, the old house in Resident Evil 7.
The old house.
The mother's map.
Oh, Marguerite's map.
Marguerite's map.
I think it's really well designed. I think that the way they set it up with the bugs and needing to navigate around that, and then it changing, and then going through it in an entirely different way later on in the game is really well set up.
Okay, and then our last kind of two questions, and then we'll get to the Q&A. What you would think is a great underrated horror game that not a lot of people have played, or not enough people have played?
Where's my Steam account?
Mood. I'm like, oh, I didn't prep for this one.
While you're saying, I can say mine. It's the Evil Within series. Most people that I've talked about have not played that game. And I think if you can especially get to the second one is a masterclass in great modern horror games.
Yeah.
I'm legitimately opening my Steam account.
Okay. Then I can ask the second question, and then I'll come back to it. What's a game that's not necessarily horror, but employs the design of horror really well in some of its sections?
BioShock. Specifically BioShock Infinite. Specifically Infinite, because Infinite even feels like less of a horror game than the first one. But it implements a lot of the same tropes and the same types of story building that horror games do.
I would say specifically the Red Lyrium sections of Dragon Age Inquisition. Because like the atmospheric shift there when you're in there and watching these people get changed by the crystallization definitely employs a lot from horror games. And like it was made before Resident Evil 7, but it reminds me a little bit of like the same with like going down into like the mold zones of Resident Evil 7, like seeing how these corpses are being affected. I thought that did really well and employed horror elements.
And I always go to the same game. The Shadow Temple from Legend of Zelda is Ocarina of Time is honestly still perhaps one of the most terrifying things I've ever had to do in a video game. So
underrated horror games.
Or you can even it doesn't even have to be necessarily like an independent game. It could be a game that you think doesn't get enough love.
I mean, I absolutely don't think that Alan Wake gets enough love, but it does get a lot of love. Beyond that, also a game that pulls a lot from horror that isn't a horror game, Fallout.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Some of the vaults that are designed as horror experiences are so well created. Sorry. Probably either World of Horror or where is it? I'm sorry, I'm going through my list again. I had one. That's what's messing me up.
That's fine.
But yeah, World of Horror, it doesn't get enough love. It's an indie game from Yisbert Games. It's just a really well done procedural game. You can play it over and over and over and over and over again.
I'm really fond of, and they're small and indie, the Fears to Fathom, which is an anthology series. Only the first 2 episodes are out, and they're making other episodes. And they're like taken from or expanded from like true stories or like submitted stories, where you sort of like play through a horror, like almost like a no sleep sort of scenario.
Wow.
Yeah. And
This
the first
looks
2,
amazing.
Yeah, those look
I
really
love
good.
I love them. The first one, you're a kid who's like home alone for the weekend, and like there's someone outside your house who ends up inside your house. And then the second one is the Norwood Hitchhiker. And you like hitchhike to a motel where like some really shady stuff is happening. And
I'll have to play these. This looks amazing.
yeah, they're really fun, and like they're really short, like about 40-minute playthroughs, and like just a really concise narrative that I really enjoy.
And free.
The
Yeah.
first one's free, yeah. Okay, so about 4 minutes. We're gonna go ahead and we're gonna answer some questions if that's all right. So kind of going in, what about games which don't give a weapon for ages, like Dark Corners of the Earth? So
Yeah.
I'm particularly seeing games that give you a weapon towards the end of the game, finally, after proving you don't need one.
So Dark Corners of the Earth gives you a gun about halfway through the game. I think the reason that game works so well, and then giving you I actually do think that giving you a gun in Dark Corners of the Earth takes away from the game. I'm of that camp. Because it's an investigative horror game. It's called Cthulhu. It's an investigative horror game. They basically only give you a gun because they wanted to add that the horror element of fighting for your life. So you have like the people of Innsmouth attacking you. I would have rather run from them and had like that sort of mechanic. I think it can work. It's not always implemented well.
What about you? Do you think of anything comes to mind about, or what your design philosophy about giving someone a weapon when they necessarily haven't been needing one for most of the game?
I can't think of any other games off the top of my head that do it. I'm trying to remember if you get a weapon in the new Amnesia game towards the end. I know you can fight the queen at the end of the new Amnesia game, whereas you can fight things beforehand. Which like I think I'm also in the camp of like, if I haven't had to fight this whole way, why would I fight now? Unless it is something like narratively satisfying, where like you fighting the monster or the entity or whatever like holds real meaning and like will actually change something in the universe. Then I suppose if you want to have that fight, you can. But if it's just like fighting to get yourself out of the situation or to like end this area, like I don't feel like it adds anything.
And I can immediately think of Alien Isolation, where you get the flamethrower partially the way through, and even though that's not considered a weapon, it's the only thing that you can directly go against the alien with and get it to back off for a couple seconds.
Everything else is useless.
Yeah. Going on to the next question, is there a video game which you want to be able to play /run/write as a TTRPG?
The Evil Within, because it actively implements character thoughts, memories, and fears into the world. And so I would love to receive like backstories from characters and fears from characters and get to build the like fearscape that they live in based off of that. I think it would be super fun.
Great answer.
I'm going to let you answer first, Nick, because I know what your answer is.
What's my answer going to be?
It's either going to be Dead Space, which I will argue you could just use Alien for.
You could just use Alien for, so I wouldn't. So I don't necessarily won't say that. I don't know. You go first. I'm still thinking about that one.
Okay. Because I was worried that we would have the same answer, and I didn't want to take yours. That's why I was going to let you go first. I think my answer would be either Resident Evil or something like now. Actually, that's no, because you could just use Call of Cthulhu for that. But sorry, my brain went to Alan Wake again. Something like Song of Horror or Layers of Fear, where a lot of the horror, it's investigative, but a lot of the horror comes from creative outlet in a way.
Even though a lot of games try to do this, I really think getting a Bloodborne TTRPG would be amazing. And I know that there are ways to flavor it, but something that can emulate the fighting design of Bloodborne would really good. The closest I can think of is what's it called? Blackbird's coming out. Is probably the closest I can think of. But definitely seeing a Bloodborne game would be amazing. Here we go. Is there an element we have three more questions left. Is there an element you wish games would quit using in horror games?
Find a key, get to the next section. Find a key,
there you
get
go.
To the next section. Find a key, get to the next section.
Repetitive loops.
Using the same mechanic to progress through the game over and over again for the entire game. Like, it was kind of cool in Resident Evil 1. Can we stop doing it?
Yeah, and like in the same vein, kind of like fetch questy puzzle solving. I hate getting to a puzzle and then finding out that the piece that I need for that puzzle is 14 rooms back, and I have to like walk my way back there. Whereas if I can solve a puzzle and like have to use the room for the solution, I find it a lot more satisfying.
As much as I like it, I dislike games that the entire gameplay loop is enter a new area, sneak past this one invincible character that is hunting you down, move to the next area, sneak past the invincible character, which is it kind of is Alien Isolation, but there's other stuff going on that it makes it.
Outlast is like that a lot.
Do you have a rec for specifically games of labyrinthine maps?
Outlast.
And also its sequel.
I haven't played 2 yet. I really need to.
I love 2. I will say though, for people who want to get into 2, if you are not a find every document kind of person, you will miss huge chunks of Outlast 2's story.
Yep.
Like huge chunks.
Yeah, Fear is like that too. And Fear is actually not the first game. It's either the second or the third game takes place in a facility that is very labyrinthine.
I immediately think of there's a really good fan game called The Joy of Creation. It was based off of Five Nights at Freddy's.
Yeah.
And that basically puts you in like a maze where you're avoiding these robots. And that's a really solid like labyrinth type horror game. Okay, here we go. Best impairment mechanic is our last question.
Impairment.
Blood loss, sleep, sanity, and restrictions to options.
Blindness. I think video games rely so much on the element of sight that taking it away from a player, and you can apply this in TTRPGs as well, taking it away and forcing you to rely on sound, forcing you to rely on other methods of determining what to do next is very fascinating. I thought of another example, a game that we haven't brought up, Amnesia.
Mm-hmm.
Amnesia does that really well with the hints that you know where you are, and the hints that you this is not new to you, but experiencing it for the first time are a really interesting way of subverting that, like understanding of where you are and understanding of what's going on in the game.
Yeah, I mentioned it very briefly when I was trying to remember games that give you weapons at the end, because the second game is not quite right. The new one that just came out, the Amnesia game that takes place in the desert. It does the same thing that you're used to with Amnesia, where you're going through a place again, and I enjoy the darkness mechanic of Amnesia. I wish it was a little bit less forgiving. Mm-hmm. I think that it's a little bit too forgiving, at least especially in the new game, because you're out in the desert so much, so there aren't as many places where that darkness starts to take a toll on you, and it kind of like loses its edge. And I wish it was like I wish that as you were in that darkness and the darkness spread across your face, like it actually did, like you said, take away sight and take away some of your ability as a player, as opposed to just kind of making the monsters find you easier.
And just to make a quick one, I think of a Slender, the any like the tape ones where you're running through the forest trying to collect the like tapes or the notes. Just because way to die in that game is just to look at Slenderman. So, and when you're not looking at him is when he can teleport around you. So it's, in order to survive, you have to take away your one advantage against the creature.
There's another game that does that. It might be Alan Wake. There's a game that uses a light mechanic that it does the same thing. I don't know if it's Alan Wake or a different game. Sorry.
We'll have to think about it. But that's all the time we have, unfortunately. I think this was a very informational panel. We covered a lot today. And I just want to give the stage to my awesome panelists, starting with Rue again. Tell them who you are again, where they can find you, and what other stuff you got cooking up.
Yeah, so my name is Rue. I use they or he pronouns. You can find me on Twitter as @IlanaKnight13. That's ILANANIGHT 13, and everywhere else as just Ilana Knight. And I'm a tabletop game designer and a sensitivity and cultural consultant, and I'm also an actual play performer. Every other Sunday, you can catch me on Huntsman's Hydra, playing in a Blades in the Dark campaign. Every other Tuesday, which this is an on week, I run an investigative horror game of my own design on Heroes Without Limits. And every other Friday, and this is an on week, I run a Tal de Rey based campaign on Bards and Brews.
Awesome. We love Huntsman Hydra here. Brandon's amazing.
Yeah.
Very much so. I'm Ian. I run Gehenna Gaming. You can find me here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nick. I'm also on Gehenna Gaming. You can find me here at Nobleman Nick. You can also catch me on some stuff over on Caring Comfort Studios. I'm also on Devil's Look Gaming, doing awesome, fun costume stuff over there. And hope you can see me at more cons, and hopefully I'll be spreading a little bit more as the summer starts to wind down a bit. That was our panel, Tales from the Code. I super appreciate all of you for talking, everyone that came out and watched. This was actually better than I expected. After getting warned of the attendance just for the panels today. We had an amazing time. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night. Goodbye.